Somewhere in the vaults of the Bank of England, there are records that have not been fully opened to the public. They concern accounts held in the names of members of the Russian imperial family in the years before the Revolution of 1917. They concern transfers made from those accounts in the months and years surrounding the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. And they concern the question of what happened to money that, by the most conservative estimates of historians who have spent careers trying to answer the question, ran into the tens of millions of pounds in early 20th century values. The Bank of England has acknowledged the existence of relevant records. It has released some of them under sustained pressure from researchers and under the provisions of freedom of information legislation. It has declined to release others, citing exemptions whose specific application to century-old financial records of a dynasty that no longer exists has struck a number of those researchers as requiring more explanation than it has received. The British royal family has not engaged with the question publicly. Not once, in the century since Nicholas II was shot in a basement in Yekaterinburg, has any official representative of the House of Windsor addressed, in any formal or sustained way, what the British government knew about Romanov assets in British institutions, what those institutions held, and what became of those holdings after July 1918. That silence is, in its own way, a piece of evidence. Not conclusive evidence. Not the kind of evidence that produces a verdict, but the kind of evidence that a careful reader of the historical record learns to sit with rather than explain away. Because the things that powerful institutions choose not to say are frequently as informative as the things they do. Join me to find out. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov became Tsar of all the Russias in November 1894 at the age of 26 on the death of his father Alexander III, and spent the following 23 years demonstrating with remarkable consistency that he was constitutionally unsuited to the role that history had assigned him. He was not unintelligent. The accounts of people who knew him personally, including foreign diplomats and family members whose testimonies have been examined in detail by historians including Robert Service, Orlando Fige, and the biographer Edvard Radzinski, describe a man of genuine personal warmth, considerable charm in private settings, and a sincere, if intermittently focused, religious faith. He was a devoted father. He was, by the standards of the Romanov dynasty, a relatively attentive husband. What he was not was a ruler. He had no instinct for political management, no appetite for the kind of sustained institutional engagement that governing an empire of 160 million people across 11 time zones required, and no reliable mechanism for distinguishing between advice that served the interests of the state and advice that served the interests of the person delivering it. He also had no reliable mechanism for understanding money at the scale his position required, which matters for the story that follows. The Romanov fortune in 1900 was, depending on which historian you are reading and which categories of asset they have chosen to include, either the largest private fortune in the world or the second largest, after the British Crown's own holdings. The difficulty of assessing it precisely derives from the difficulty of separating, in the Russian imperial context, what belonged to the Tsar personally, what belonged to the dynasty as an institution, what belonged to the state in a form that the Tsar controlled but did not personally own, and what had been accumulated through a series of financial arrangements whose documentation was as deliberately opaque as the people who designed them could make it. The personal portion of the fortune, the element that Nicholas and Alexandra controlled directly and could theoretically deploy as they chose, included substantial landholdings in Russia, jewels of extraordinary value whose inventory has never been fully published, interests in various Russian commercial enterprises, and, critically, for the purposes of this story, deposits in foreign banks. The foreign deposits were not a secret, exactly. They were not advertised, but they were known to exist by the governments of the countries in which the relevant institutions operated, and they were known to exist by the senior figures in those institutions, and they represented a form of insurance that the Romanov family had been maintaining, with varying degrees of deliberateness, since the instability of the late 19th century had made the idea of money outside Russia seem prudent. The Bank of England's relationship with the Romanov dynasty predated Nicholas II and extended well beyond him. The relationship was, in the language of central banking, a correspondent relationship, meaning that the Bank of England maintained accounts and conducted transactions on behalf of the Russian imperial government and, separately, on behalf of individual members of the imperial family. The specific nature of those accounts, the amounts held, the transactions conducted, and the instructions received regarding their management in the period between 1914 and 1918 are the subject of the records that remain partially restricted. What the released portions of the Bank of England's archive show, and what has been documented most thoroughly by the historian William Clark in his 2003 book, The Lost Fortune of the Tsars, which remains the most systematic attempt to trace the money across multiple jurisdictions, is the following. Nicholas II maintained personal accounts at Baring Brothers, the merchant bank, and through correspondent arrangements involving the Bank of England. The amounts in those accounts fluctuated across the years of his reign, but by the period immediately preceding the First World War, they were substantial. Clark's estimate, based on the documentation he was able to access, places the figure in the range of several £1,000,000 sterling, which, at 1914, values represented a sum of enormous magnitude by any standard outside the accounts of the very wealthiest private individuals in Europe. During the First World War, the financial relationship between the British government and the Russian imperial government became considerably more complex. Britain was lending Russia money to prosecute the war. Russia was placing orders for war materiel through British intermediaries. The Bank of England was at the center of transactions involving the Russian state that ran, across the war years, to hundreds of millions of pounds. Inside this vast, official financial relationship, the personal accounts of the Tsar and his family continued to exist. The question of whether those personal accounts were clearly distinguished from the official state accounts, whether transactions between them were properly documented, and whether the people managing them on both sides understood the distinction between money that belonged to Nicholas personally and money that belonged to Russia as a state, is a question the partially released archive raises without fully answering. It is a question that matters considerably for what happened after 1917. The February Revolution of 1917 removed Nicholas from the throne. The October Revolution of the same year removed the provisional government that had replaced him and installed the Bolshevik government under Lenin. By the time the dust settled in the autumn of 1917, the Romanov dynasty had been deposed, the family placed under arrest, and a new government was in power in Petrograd, whose attitude toward the financial assets of the former ruling house was, to put it precisely, acquisitive. The Bolshevik government almost immediately began making inquiries, through various channels, about Romanov assets held outside Russia. These inquiries were directed at the governments of Britain, France, and Germany, at various private banking institutions, and at individuals who were believed to have knowledge of where money had been placed. The inquiries were, in the main, rebuffed. The governments of Britain and France, which were still at war with Germany and had not yet concluded that the Bolshevik government was a permanent political fact that required formal recognition, declined to assist. This is the point at which the historical record becomes significantly murkier, and at which the questions that have driven researchers for a century begin to sharpen. If significant Romanov personal assets existed in British financial institutions in 1917, and the released portions of the Bank of England archive confirm that they did, what happened to them after the Revolution? After the murder of the imperial family in July 1918? After the end of the First World War? After the British government formally recognized the Soviet Union in 1924? The theoretical possibilities are a limited set. The money could have been transferred to surviving Romanov relatives before or after the revolution, of whom there were many, scattered across Europe, with varying degrees of claim on the family's assets. It could have been frozen pending resolution of competing claims that were never resolved. It could have been absorbed into the British government's own accounts through mechanisms that wartime financial arrangements made legally available. It could have been transferred to the Soviet government as part of the various diplomatic and financial settlements that accompanied British recognition of the USSR. Or some combination of all of these could have occurred, with different portions of the assets following different routes. Clark's research, and the subsequent work of researchers, including Tony Summers and Tom Mangold, and more recently the investigative work done by journalists examining the released Bank of England documents, suggests that the answer is not cleanly any one of these options. What the evidence shows is a picture of deliberate administrative complexity applied to accounts whose precise status was, to those managing them, genuinely ambiguous, and whose ambiguity was not always resolved in the direction of maximum transparency. The figure whose role in the management of Romanov assets has generated the most sustained historical controversy is not a banker, it is a king. George V of Great Britain was, by the genealogical arithmetic of the European royal families of the early 20th century, Nicholas II's first cousin. Their mothers were sisters. They had grown up in proximity. They bore a physical resemblance to each other that was sufficiently striking that photographs of the two men standing together produced a visual effect that struck contemporaries as almost disconcerting. In March 1917, immediately following the February Revolution and the abdication of Nicholas, the British government, under Lloyd George, offered political asylum to the former Tsar and his family. The offer was formally made. It was formally accepted by the Provisional Government of Russia. It was, within weeks, quietly withdrawn. The withdrawal of the asylum offer is one of the most examined decisions in the history of the British monarchy and the British government of the Lloyd George period, and the examination has produced, across a century, a fairly substantial consensus about what happened. George V intervened. He communicated to his government, through his private secretary Lord Stamfordham, that the presence of Nicholas and his family in Britain would be politically damaging to the monarchy at a moment when the institution was already under significant Republican pressure. The working class of Britain, exhausted by war and increasingly sympathetic to the revolutionary politics sweeping Europe, would not, George calculated, look favorably on the British crown providing sanctuary to the Tsar of all the Russias. Stamfordham's letters communicating the king's concern are in the royal archives and have been quoted in detail by historians, including Kenneth Rose and Michael Carter. They are unambiguous about the king's role in the reversal of the asylum offer. What they do not address, and what no document in any archive that has been made publicly available addresses, is whether George V's decision about the asylum offer was connected in any way to his knowledge of what Romanov assets were held in British financial institutions. The connection, if it exists, would be of a specific and uncomfortable kind. A king who declined to rescue his cousin from almost certain death at the hands of revolutionaries, while simultaneously managing or having knowledge of financial assets that belonged to that cousin and would, on the cousin's death, become subject to competing claims of significant complexity, is a king whose motivations require careful examination rather than charitable assumption. The evidence for a direct connection between the asylum decision and the financial question is circumstantial. It is also, in the assessment of historians, including Helen Rappaport, whose 2018 book, The Race to Save the Romanovs, is the most recent and most thorough examination of the asylum question, suggestive enough to require engagement rather than dismissal. What the historical record shows is that George V knew about the Romanov assets in British institutions. He knew because his government knew, and because the management of those assets required at some level the awareness of the palace, given the personal nature of the accounts and the family relationship between the two monarchs. He knew, therefore, that the question of what happened to those assets would be significantly more complicated if Nicholas was alive in Britain than if Nicholas was not alive at all. That knowledge is not evidence of a decision. It is context for a decision that was made. The distinction matters. The distinction is also, in the absence of the full Bank of England archive, impossible to fully resolve. The surviving Romanovs spent much of the 20th century attempting to establish what had happened to the family's assets, and the attempts are themselves a significant piece of the evidentiary record. The senior surviving relative of the immediate imperial family was Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse, Nicholas's brother-in-law, who in the 1920s and 1930s engaged in a sustained correspondence with various European banking institutions and with members of the British royal family about the question of the Romanov deposits. The correspondence, portions of which have been made available by the Hesse family archive, shows a man who believed that significant assets had existed, who believed that those assets had not been properly accounted for, and who found the responses he received from British institutions consistently unhelpful in ways that he found suspicious. The broader Romanov family, through various legal proceedings across the 20th century, mounted a series of attempts to establish claims against assets in Swiss, British, and German banks. The Swiss proceedings were the most sustained and produced the most documentation. They established, to the satisfaction of Swiss courts in the 1990s, that accounts in the names of Romanov family members had existed at a number of Swiss institutions. The courts were less successful in establishing what had happened to the money in those accounts, because the institutions involved produced documentation that was, in several cases, incomplete in ways that the courts noted but could not remedy. The British proceedings were less advanced, because the British institutions involved were less forthcoming. The Bank of England, in response to Freedom of Information requests submitted across the 2000s and 2010s, released portions of its records relating to Romanov accounts, while declining to release others under exemptions relating to information supplied in confidence and information whose release would prejudice the conduct of public affairs. The application of those exemptions to records from the reign of a dynasty that ceased to exist in 1917 has been challenged by researchers and by Freedom of Information campaigners who have argued, with some force, that the standard justifications for those exemptions cannot plausibly apply to transactions conducted more than a century ago. The Bank of England has maintained its position. In 1998, the remains of Nicholas II, Alexandra, and 3 of their 5 children were formally identified through DNA analysis and given a state funeral in St. Petersburg. The identification confirmed what most historians had concluded decades earlier. The family had been shot in Yekaterinburg in July 1918, and the various claimants who had appeared across the 20th century asserting survival were not who they claimed to be. The identification of the remains resolved the question of what had happened to the people. It did not resolve the question of what had happened to the money. In the same year, the Russian government under Boris Yeltsin formally acknowledged the murder of the imperial family and issued a statement that included a reference to the importance of accounting for Romanov assets held abroad. The statement was addressed to the governments of Britain, France, Switzerland, and Germany. The responses it received were, in the diplomatic language of the period, cautious. The British response, delivered through the Foreign Office, noted that any questions about historical financial matters would need to be addressed through appropriate channels and expressed a general willingness to cooperate with legitimate inquiries. The specific question of what the Bank of England held and what had happened to those holdings was not addressed in the public response. The pattern of the response was, by this point in the story, familiar. Acknowledge the question. Express general willingness. Provide no specific answer. That pattern has held through multiple governments of different political colors from 1918 to the present day. It has held through the Cold War, when there was a geopolitical argument for not engaging with questions that could benefit Soviet historical narratives. It has held through the post-Cold War period, when that argument ceased to apply. It has held through the centenary commemorations of the Revolution in 2017, which generated substantial historical attention to the Romanov story without generating any new disclosure from British financial institutions. The consistency of the non-disclosure across a century of changing political circumstances suggests that the reasons for it are not primarily political in the conventional sense. They are not about current diplomatic relations with Russia, which have varied enormously across the relevant period. They are not about Cold War sensitivities that ceased to apply 30 years ago. They are about something that has remained constant across all of those varying circumstances. The most parsimonious explanation for a consistent behavior is a consistent motive. The question of what the British royal family knew and when, and what it did with that knowledge, is a question the institution has the resources to answer and has chosen not to. The Royal Archives at Windsor contain correspondence between George V and his government from the relevant period that has been selectively released. The portions released include the Stamfordham letters about the asylum offer. They do not include, in any form that has been made publicly available, correspondence specifically addressing the question of what the palace knew about Romanov financial assets in British institutions, and what instructions, if any, the palace gave or received about the management of those assets. The absence may be innocent. Archives are incomplete. Documents are lost. The correspondence may never have existed in the form that would make it relevant, because the financial management was handled at a level below the palace's direct involvement. It may also not be innocent. Selective preservation of archives is a practice that institutions with long memories and strong interests in their own reputations engage in, and the British royal family is an institution with a longer memory and a stronger interest in its own reputation than almost any other. Hugo Vickers, the royal biographer who has spent decades working with the Royal Archives and who has written authoritatively about the management of the royal family's historical record, has noted in various contexts that the archives are extraordinarily well organized and that the organization reflects decisions about what to preserve and what not to preserve that were made with considerable deliberateness across the 20th century. What is in the Royal Archives is what someone decided should be in the Royal Archives. That observation does not tell you what is missing. It tells you that the question of what is missing is a serious one, and that the answer to it is not available through any channel currently open to researchers. The Romanov money story is not a simple story of theft, though theft may be part of it. It is a story about the specific way in which the apparatus of the British state and the apparatus of the British monarchy managed an extremely sensitive financial and political situation across a period of enormous historical disruption, and about the specific choices made at each stage of that management, about what to document, what to disclose, and what to leave in the condition that institutions describe, when they are being candid, as deliberately ambiguous. William Clark's estimate of the total value of Romanov assets that passed through or were held in British institutions across the relevant period, including the personal deposits, the war loan transactions, the various correspondent account arrangements, and the assets of other Romanov family members beyond the immediate imperial family, runs to a figure that in modern values would be measured in the billions rather than the millions. That figure is an estimate, with significant uncertainty attached to it. Clark himself presents it as a calculation based on incomplete information, and he is honest about the incompleteness. The incompleteness is not accidental. It is the product of the very non-disclosure whose existence the figure is designed to illustrate. What the released portions of the archive show is enough to confirm that the question is real, that the money existed, and that its disposal is not accounted for in any public record. What the unreleased portions might show is the subject of reasonable inference rather than documented fact. The inference runs as follows. Institutions do not maintain restrictions on century-old records unless those records contain something the institution prefers to keep restricted. The exemptions applied to the Bank of England's unreleased Romanov files are not technical exemptions about archival procedure. They are substantive exemptions about the content of the information. Substantive exemptions on century-old financial records suggest that the content of those records would, if disclosed, cause some form of difficulty for some party that the institution is in a position of responsibility toward. The institution in question is the Bank of England. The parties it is in a position of responsibility toward are, ultimately, the British state and the interests associated with it. The Romanov money did not evaporate. Money does not evaporate. It moves. It accumulates. It is absorbed into other pools of capital, and it leaves traces in the records of the institutions through which it passed, and those traces are either preserved or they are not. And the decision about whether to preserve them is made by people who understand what the traces show. Nicholas II was shot on the night of the 16th of July, 1918, in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, along with Alexandra, their 5 children, their doctor, and 3 servants. He was 50 years old. He had been Tsar for 23 years and a prisoner for 17 months. His cousin George V, who had declined to offer him asylum 18 months earlier, learned of the killing through diplomatic channels and recorded his response in his diary, with the characteristic flatness that George's diary entries reserved for events he found emotionally difficult. His diary entry for the day he learned of Nicholas's death is 4 lines long. It does not mention money. It does not mention the accounts at Baring Brothers or the transactions through the Bank of England, or the question of what would happen to the assets of the former Tsar now that the former Tsar was dead. It expresses, in the compressed and controlled language of a man who had grown up understanding that his private thoughts were not entirely private, something that reads as genuine grief. Whether the grief was uncomplicated by the knowledge that the death of his cousin resolved certain financial questions that the survival of his cousin would have made considerably more complex, is not something the diary entry allows the reader to determine. The diary entry does not allow it because it was written by a man who understood, at a level of institutional instinct so deep it had become character, that there were things you did not write down. The Bank of England understands the same thing. The British royal family has understood it for longer than either of them. And the money, wherever it went somewhere that the paper trail has been carefully managed to make difficult to follow. The difficulty is not accidental. The difficulty is the story. And the story, a century after the shots in the basement in Yekaterinburg, has not been told in full. The records that would tell it remain, in the vaults of an institution on Threadneedle Street in London, restricted, waiting for a disclosure that, if the pattern of the last 100 years is any guide, is not coming soon.